I'll tell you what stands out the most on the Buccaneers schedule, that and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome into this live episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listen review every single day. Don't forget you can subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can follow along on Twitter. I am James Yarcho at @Yarcho_Bucs, credentialed member of the media covering your Tampa Bay Buccaneers as deputy editor of SB Nation's BucsNation.com. Here with you every Monday through Friday, along with the everydayers and the every livers who have been blowing up the chat well before this episode even started. And I want to share my appreciation for your continued support of the show. One of the ways you can support the show, become a Locked On Bucs insider. You're going to get news, rumors, updates, general thoughts, one-on-one conversations with me via text message. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs to become an insider today. This episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Some interesting tidbits about the Buccaneers schedule coming up in a little bit, but let's start with the schedule release itself and when the Bucs are going to square off against their opponents. We've known those opponents for quite a while, but now we know when, where, how, and on what channel they will be. So for those of you that are insiders, I texted out a few things today, including a leaked schedule for the Buccaneers. And while we won't know if some of my predictions are correct, quite a few of them were not. But that schedule that I tweeted out, or that I texted out to the insiders, ended up being what the schedule was. Let's start with the first half of the schedule. And I'll also mention real quick, for the preseason, the Buccaneers are at Cincinnati on August 10th, at Jacksonville on August 17th, and home against the Miami Dolphins on August 23rd. All in all, the Bucs have 4 primetime games. They have 3 games that are at 4:05 or 4:25, 9 games on Fox, 3 on CBS, 2 on ESPN, 1 on NBC, and 1 on Amazon Prime. Week 1, the Buccaneers are going to start their season off at home against the Washington Commanders at 4:25 p.m. Then in week 2, it's a divisional round matchup against a divisional round rematch at Detroit against the Lions at 1 o'clock. Then they're home against the Denver Broncos at 1 o'clock. Week 4, it is the return of Devin White as the Eagles come to town. That game is at 1 o'clock. At Atlanta on Thursday Night Football in week 5. Week 6 at the New Orleans Saints. That's a 1 o'clock kickoff. Week 7, another primetime game against the Baltimore Ravens at home on Monday night. Week 8, they get the Falcons again, this time at home. That's a 1 o'clock kickoff. And then week 9 at Kansas City on Monday Night Football. So the first couple of things that jump out to me here, looking at the first half of the schedule, are starting at home, which is always a good thing, but also starting at home against a rookie quarterback and a familiar head coach. Obviously, Todd Bowles knows Dan Quinn very well from his time in Atlanta, and it will be an interesting matchup to see how they prepare for that rookie quarterback in his first NFL start. Also, how fitting is it that the very first crossover Thursday of the season since David Harrison left the show will be with David Harrison? I love that so much. Spoiler alert, and you guys can prepare to get mad at me now. I will be in Tampa covering that game along with David. Should be a great time. The second thing that jumps out is having 3 divisional games in the first 9 weeks and having both games against the Falcons done before the midway point of the season. I know some of you are twitching a little bit, remembering the horrendous beatdown that the Bucs suffered against the Falcons on Thursday Night Football, years ago. This is an entirely different group of players, different coaches, different everything. So we'll see if the Bucs can return the favor and force the Falcons to put Michael Penix in during a lost cause. Also, 3 primetime games in a span of 5 weeks is absolutely crazy. I'll talk more about the tough stretches and the easy stretches coming up on tomorrow's show, but the world will get a solid view of where the Bucs are within their division against the odds-on favorite in prime time when they take on the Atlanta Falcons before taking on one of the Super Bowl contenders in prime time 2 weeks later, then taking on the defending champions, in prime time 2 weeks after that. I'm honestly a little surprised that they have the divisional round rematch so early in the season against the Detroit Lions. I was kind of with Evan when we talked about it on Wednesday's episode, that game might have enough hype around it to be in prime time, might be late October, early November, but right out of the gate, the Bucs get to return to the place where their season ended last year and look to try and I don't want to say exact revenge. You're not going to get revenge on a playoff loss in a week 2 matchup in the following season, but maybe the Bucs have the opportunity now to show Detroit that if they meet again in the postseason, the Bucs are better than what they showed back in January. Of course, you have the storyline of Carlton Davis now being in Detroit, having to go up against Mike Evans or Chris Godwin or whoever he is going to be matched up against. And then finally, another playoff rematch in week 4 against the Philadelphia Eagles. I mentioned it's the return of Devin White to Raymond James Stadium. I'm sure he will be greeted warmly and favorably by all the Buccaneers fans in attendance. But then, in week 9, in prime time again, the rematch of Super Bowl 55 when the Bucs take on the Kansas City Swifts. No word yet as to whether or not Taylor and her Swifties will be in attendance, but that game will likely be a big spotlight for the week 9 slate across the NFL. Going to jump into the chat real quick. A lot of you guys were blowing up this chat before I even got started. Destined for Greatness says, I think we could go 3-1 in the first 4 games. Very possible. I will have my week by week, way too early schedule predictions coming up on tomorrow's episode. Spoiler alert, I have to record, on Friday's episode. I have to record Friday's episode when I'm done with this live. My son and I leave Thursday night to go to Pittsburgh for him to play in a hockey tournament. I will not be back until late Sunday. So I have to get that episode done and ready for you ahead of time, which means recording again right after we're done with this live episode. I saw a couple of you guys talking about Destined for Greatness. I think was the first one to mention it. Possibly only 2 quote unquote cold weather games, and then goes on to mention Kansas City and the Giants both in November, and then went on to say, would it really even be that cold? I would say there's a real good chance in New York in November it can get pretty cold, and Kansas City is kind of like Ohio. It can get real cold real fast, or it can stay nice and comfortable to the point that you're just walking around in a long sleeve tee and jeans well into late December. It's kind of hit or miss there in Kansas City, but definitely something to keep an eye on. David in the chat, Insider David, James, we go into the preseason game at Paycor. I'm going to go ahead and give it a shot. We'll see if I can get in there with the Bengals media department and cover that game as well before heading down to Tampa for week 1 against the Washington Commanders. Let's see. That's a lot of things. R4G3 quitting 101 says week 7 through 10 could be rough. I am going to get into my toughest stretch and my easiest stretch again coming up on tomorrow's episode. But for right now, we have to talk about the second half of the schedule and some of the takeaways from that slate. That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of the NBA, which makes getting playoff tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. And you better believe I'm keeping an eye on the Celtics, trying to play in that trip for my son to see them in action against the Pacers if Indianapolis can get past the New York Knicks. And those last-minute deals from Game Time are the best way to make sure we get in to see his favorite team. With Game Time's last-minute deals, I can save up to 60% off for those playoff tickets. Once I find where we're going to be sitting, being able to use Apple Pay and have those tickets on my phone in just 2 clicks makes the process about as easy as you can get. No surprises either. With all-in pricing, I know exactly what I'll spend when I'm looking for where we're going to sit. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, all one word, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thank you again for making Locked On Bucs your first listen review every single day. Every day is make sure you come back tomorrow. I've already mentioned we're talking about the toughest stretches. We're talking about the easiest stretches. We're talking about game by game win-loss predictions that are way too early, and you guys are only allowed to bring up those predictions if I am right. Otherwise, they are null and void. In the meantime, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, first 9 games down. There are 8 more to go, and here's how the second half of the season breaks down for the Bucs. In Week 10, home against the San Francisco 49ers, a 1 o'clock start, which is really interesting. That's a little bit of an advantage for the Buccaneers, with San Francisco having to travel from the West Coast. Week 11 is the bye week. I love this bye week for the Buccaneers. It's about as in the middle as you're going to be able to get. Perfect timing for the bye week for the Buccaneers. So I love that for them. Last year was really early in the season. I saw David Harrison talking about the Commanders not getting a bye until week 14. That's really, really late. Love the week 11 bye for the Buccaneers. Then they come out of the bye, head to MetLife to take on the New York Giants. That's a 1 o'clock kickoff. Then at Carolina against Dave Canales and the Panthers. That's a 4:05 kickoff. Week 14, they're home against the Raiders at 1 o'clock. Week 15, they travel to California to take on Jim Harbaugh and the Los Angeles Chargers. That's a 4:25 kickoff. Week 16, at the Dallas Cowboys on Sunday Night Football. Week 17, against the Carolina Panthers at home. That's a 1 o'clock game. And then they finish the season at home against the New Orleans Saints. No time set for that yet. Remember, the NFL does not set times for Week 18 games. They see how things are kind of shaking out, try to put the most important, the games with the biggest playoff implications in those prime spots. So we're not going to know the kickoff time for that game until late in the season. As I mentioned, I love that Week 11 bye, especially coming off of that stretch. I'll talk more about it tomorrow, but here are some more of the things that jump out to me. For starters, 4 road games in 5 weeks is rough. You have 2 on the East Coast, 1 on the West Coast, then Dallas in prime time to round that out. That is not easy. I already hate the fact that the Bucs have to play in MetLife Stadium with that awful turf that claims the souls of football players like it's the Grim Reaper. But that kicks off the stretch where the Bucs will only be home 1 time over the course of over a month. Next up, similar to the first half of the season, the Bucs have the rest of their divisional matchups clumped together. Both games against the Panthers in a span of a month before ending things with the Saints, which may have serious playoff implications. Last year, the Bucs ended with back-to-back divisional games. They ended up losing to the Saints in Week 17, and that caused me to lose a bet with Locked On Saints host Ross Jackson, for which I have to pay dearly. by wearing a Taysom Hill t-shirt during our Locked On divisional preview. That's going to basically kill a little part of me. And then the Bucs will go on to win, obviously, in week 18. But this time, it's the Panthers in week 17, the Saints in week 18. Those two games could have huge ramifications for the division in terms of the standings, in terms of the tiebreakers. That is a big end to the year. I also love the fact that the Bucs have 4 of 5 on the road in this half. Then they have their last 2 at home. Again, when you're talking games this late in the season, if you have to have a stretch where you have 4 out of 5 on the road to end at home, especially with divisional games, that is a massive advantage for Tampa. If they are in the hunt or in the thick of the playoff race, in the thick of the NFC South race, that stadium should be mostly Buccaneers fans. There will be some Carolina and New Orleans fans, of course, that come to Tampa, especially using the holidays for a little extra wiggle room on their travel. But Ray J should be rocking and really give the Bucs an advantage in those final 2 games. Unlike the first half of the season, just one primetime game over the second half of the Bucs schedule. They have 4 total primetime games thanks to 3 straight division titles, 4 straight playoff appearances, being the surprise team or one of these surprise teams of last year. And of course, there's always that possibility that game against the Saints gets flexed in week 18 to another primetime game. If that is a game that will decide the winner of the NFC South and somebody who's not going to make the playoffs at all, it's going to be really hard for the NFL to find a game with bigger playoff implications than that. Going to be really interesting to see how that all shakes out. Going to jump into the chat again before we hit the break. David Huber in the chat says, bold prediction, they will win at least 13 games. It just feels like something big is on the horizon. That is real bold. And then Donald, every bit as bold. I got the Bucs going 5-1 in the first 6. We lose at Detroit. Then Donald goes on to say, I have the Bucs at 6-2 from weeks 10 through 18. Lose to the Niners and maybe the Chargers or the Cowboys. You guys, you guys are really looking for a significant increase in the win total over last year. What do we got? We got Rashad in the chat. The NFL going to put some respect on our team this year. Hashtag go Bucs. Well, it certainly is nice to see them get that primetime respect. You all know how much I dislike primetime games because of my other job and how it messes with my schedule. But as long as they can win those primetime games, or at least win half of them, given some of the matchups that they have, they are going to let the world know that last year wasn't a fluke. And this Buccaneers team can very well make some noise in the playoffs as well. I'm going to tell you what my top 3 games are this season, and I can promise you this, they're not the ones that you're thinking of. That's coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, parlays, and much more. You can bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks to three-pointers, all on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. The Boston Celtics are the favorites to win the NBA Finals at -130, followed by the defending champion Denver Nuggets. What a comeback they've had in their series. They're now at +240. And then the Oklahoma City Thunder have jumped into third in the NBA Finals odds at +800. In the race for Lord Stanley's Cup, the greatest trophy in all of sports, the Dallas Stars are the new favorites at +230, followed by the Florida Panthers at +290, then the Edmonton Oilers at +460. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Wrapping things up here on a live schedule reaction episode of the Locked On Bucs podcast and looking at the structure and the timing of Buccaneers opponents. What are my top 3 most anticipated games for this season? And I'm going to start with week 5 against the Atlanta Falcons. I know. A lot of you probably expected me to pick either of the playoff rematches with the Detroit Lions or the Philadelphia Eagles, but I think the Falcons game is the first really big one for the Bucs. As I have mentioned on this show numerous times, everybody just loves the Falcons right now. They are the media darlings. They are the sweethearts. It's Kirk Cousins. It's Raheem Morris. It's the New Orleans Saints from last year all over again. All of a sudden, everybody loved the Saints. They were the favorites, blah, blah, blah. To have a chance to not only go into Atlanta, but to do it in prime time and blow their doors off would be a huge early season statement. And yes, beating Detroit, beating Philadelphia, that can also make a statement. And those games will play a factor down the line. But this is the first division game for the Buccaneers, and it's against the odds-on favorite to win the NFC South. Tag them, clean them, fry them, destroy the Dirty Birds, and absolutely put the NFL world and the rest of the NFC South on notice. The second biggest game on the schedule to me is Week 10 with the San Francisco 49ers. They are widely considered the best team in the NFC. They were the Super Bowl runner-ups last year. This is a chance for the Bucs to go into the bye with another statement. This isn't the team that the 49ers beat last year. This isn't the team that they absolutely dominated 2 years ago. This is a team that can go toe-to-toe with them if they were to meet again. The Niners are the measuring stick to which all NFC teams are going to be compared, and the Bucs have to be up for that one. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to win that one. It would be nice, but you come out of there in a close, hard-fought game that gets decided in the fourth quarter, that in and of itself makes a statement. And if you see them again in the postseason, they're going to have that in the back of their minds that, look, the Bucs aren't any pushovers. They took us to the limit last time. They could beat us this time, or they could beat us again. That game is going to be a huge one for the Bucs, and it'll tell a lot of people exactly where the Bucs stand in the hierarchy of the NFC. Finally, the home finale against the Saints. This is one that the Bucs and Saints are both going to have circled, as well as their fan bases. Cam Jordan did all that talking all last year leading up to the season, talking about, oh, well, the Bucs are going to go back to where they were, and it turned into a huge social media thing. Even after they won the division, he kept doing it. He was getting called out by members of the team. If I remember correctly, I think even Jason Light made a comment about Cam's comments on Twitter. There's no question that the Buccaneers and the Saints do not like one another. There's always that underlying feud between Mike Evans and Marshawn Lattimore, if Lattimore's even still with the team. There's the possibility that he could end up gone. This game could decide who wins the division and who's watching the playoffs from home. Finally, I do have to adjust one of my predictions. And I realize it's not fair to do that because I did it before the schedule came out, but I feel like this is one that I can kind of pivot from. I said that the Bucs were going to wear their creamsicle jerseys at home against the Saints if there was a creamsicle game. But if they do a throwback game, it's not going to be in week 18. They're not going to save it for the end of the year. It's going to be in the middle sometime. So now I'm kind of leaning towards Evan's prediction of week 4 against the Eagles. But man, think about this for a minute. I would love to see them wear those creamsicle uniforms with Bucko Bruce on the helmet in prime time against the Baltimore Ravens. I know the Bucs only wore these uniforms in the Ravens' first official season, but it would be absolutely awesome to have the Bucs break them out on a Monday night when you know all that fanfare is going on with ESPN being in town, it being the Monday Night Football game. It's the must-see game of the week, all those things, plus everything that the Bucs did to get the city and the area ready for that throwback game last year. You combine all that, Tampa is going to be electric that entire week. I would love to see them wear those in prime time against Baltimore, but I think the most likely scenario is probably against the Eagles. So shout out to Evan if that ends up happening. Going to jump in the chat one more time. We got Noah 2023 saying Atlanta doesn't worry me. Dallas and San Francisco is more worrisome. I'm not really worried about the Atlanta Falcons, but I do feel that first matchup, especially being in Atlanta on prime time, that is going to be a big one for the Bucs. That is a game that they have to come away from with a win. Gary in the chat says, I like the schedule. Again, I'll talk about the good and the bad coming up on tomorrow's episode when I do another dive. We got Rashad saying the Raiders game would be lit. I'm guessing you're talking about if they wore the creamsicles for the Raiders game, that would be pretty cool. I think I would like that a lot. I would imagine for that one, they're going to wear their reds. They're going to wear their red tops, their pewter pants, harken back to Super Bowl 37. But it would be cool to see them wear their creamsicles against a team like the Raiders. Scotty J in the chat says our linebacking core is suspect. 54 is hurt. Then what? Could be 10 wins. I said 9 wins last year. Their linebacking core is deep. I will say that. There's a lot of things that they can do at inside linebacker. Obviously, everyone wants Levante to play the full 17 games. He is the heart and soul. He is the unquestioned captain and leader on the defensive side of the ball. But you have KJ Britt, who stepped up and played big last year. You have JJ Russell, who stepped up and played big. You have Servassier Dennis now, in the versatility and athleticism that he brings with a year under his belt. He's going to play a bigger role. You have Chris Braswell that can line up at inside linebacker and do some damage there. You have a lot of pieces there that you can kind of move around and utilize at inside linebacker. You have Kalen DeLoach, the undrafted free agent out of Florida State. I think he makes the team. He could be a legitimate X factor, especially if you get late into the season. I like the Bucs linebacking core. They don't have a marquee name like Devin White to go alongside of Levante David, but what they do have is a group of guys that are better producers on the field than Devin White was. More consistent, more reliable. I really am not worried about the inside linebacker group. Finally, Fausto, thank you. Oh, you're the best. Keep in mind, Cousins always misses the bus for primetime games. That he does. If there's one thing that you can count on when it comes to Kirk Cousins, it's his ability to really screw things up if a game starts after 1 o'clock or after week 18. So that is going to do it for this episode. Thank you all so much for joining in the live. I know you guys had a lot of options for live Buccaneers shows going on at this time. I appreciate so much that you decided to spend some time with me. Again, coming up tomorrow, I'll give you my easiest stretch, my toughest stretch, and do a way too early win-loss prediction based on the schedule. So make sure you come back for that. Check out everything going on over at BucsNation.com. Follow on Twitter at Locked On Bucs, at JYarcho_Bucs. Become a Locked On Bucs insider. Go to joinsubtext.com Locked On Bucs, and make sure that you are subscribed on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're sick of listening to your local sports stations on the radio, if you feel like, other sports talk doesn't cover the Bucs well enough, play me in your car. Hook me up to the Apple CarPlay, the Android Auto, file it through that podcast app of choice, and take me along a ride with you to work, from work, wherever you are headed. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding day. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. I want to thank you so much for joining me right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.